The dog appeared every morning at 7:48 a.m., like clockwork. Rain or shine, summer or snow, he would trot down Maple Street with his head low, tail swaying in slow rhythm, and settle beside the third bench at the Oak Ridge bus stop. He never barked, never chased anyone, just sat, watching, waiting. The first time people noticed him, it was because of the time. Every morning, same minute, same spot. He wouldn't lie down. He wouldn't wander. He'd just sit with his back straight and his eyes fixed on the road. When the 7:55 bus arrived, he'd look up, watch each person step off. Then, as the last foot touched the pavement and the doors closed again, he'd drop his head, turn around, and walk back down the street. Every single day. He never missed a morning. Kids named him Shadow. Old folks called him the Sentinel. A few people tried to feed him. He'd sniff the food, sometimes take a bite, but only after the bus left. The driver, Linda, a kind woman in her 60s, started saving a biscuit from her breakfast for him. She didn't know his name, but she talked to him like an old friend. "Still waiting, huh?" she'd say, handing him the treat through the open door. He never came closer than a foot. Just took the food gently, blinked once, and walked away. No one knew where he came from.
No collar.
No tegues. But he was clean, well-fed. Someone was caring for him or had been. Over the years, his muzzle grew whiter, his steps slower, but the routine never changed. He came, he waited, he left, and no one ever came for him. Not until that Tuesday in October, 9 years after he first appeared. The leaves had started to fall, and a chill had crept into the wind. Linda's bus pulled up like always. The doors hissed open. The usual passengers stepped off. Mrs. Patel with her floral umbrella, the college kid with headphones, the tall man who never smiled. And then came a new face, a man in his 30s, brown coat, tired eyes, a limp on his right leg. He stepped down, looked up, and froze. The dog was there, sitting on the bench's edge, watching him. The man stared. Something in his face cracked, like a memory surfacing too fast. His lips moved. "Murphy?" The dog didn't move. Then slowly he stood, walked forward, stopped a foot away. The man fell to his knees. "Murphy," he said again, louder now, like he couldn't believe the sound of it. "How are you still?" The dog whined, barely audible, then pressed his head into the man's chest. And everything around them went quiet. For a long moment, nothing moved except the leaves swirling in the wind around them. The man knelt on the sidewalk, arms wrapped gently around the German shepherd's neck, one hand buried in his thick fur, the other trembling as if afraid this was all some cruel dream. Murphy didn't move. He leaned into the man's chest like a weight he had finally allowed himself to release, like the act of waiting had ended and he could breathe again. The passengers at the stop stood still. No one spoke. Even Linda, who had seen all manner of people and pets on her route for over 30 years, had tears gathering behind her glasses. She stepped down from the bus. "You know him?" The man looked up, blinking rapidly. "He's my dog," he said softly. "I lost him. I thought." He stopped, swallowed. "He disappeared 9 years ago. I never found him." "He's been coming here every day," Linda said, her voice breaking, "since the fall of 2014. Never missed a morning." The man lowered his head, pressing his forehead gently against Murphy's. 9 years, he whispered. "You were waiting for me?" Murphy let out a long, slow breath, as if in answer. The man sat back on the curb, still keeping one hand on the dog's back. "My name's Jake," he told the gathering crowd. "And this boy, this is Murphy." He looked around. "How long has he really been coming here?" "Every day," Linda repeated. "Like clockwork. Rain, snow, heat waves. Always 7:48 a.m. waits for the bus. Watches every person. Then walks back the same way he came." Jake looked down at his dog again, eyes wide with disbelief. "He used to walk with me to the bus stop when I worked downtown. Back then, I'd tell him to go home once I got on, and he always did. But one morning," he paused, "I never came back. I was hit by a car crossing the street in the city. spent weeks in the hospital, months in rehab. My memory was gone, scrambled. I didn't even remember I had a dog at first. By the time I got out, everything had changed. He looked up. I went back to our house, but Murphy was gone. The neighbors hadn't seen him. I looked for him for months, years even. Nothing. He paused. I moved away eventually. I always felt like I left something behind, but I didn't know what. Murphy sat down beside him now, his shoulder leaning into Jake's side. Eyes half closed in that old, loyal way dogs have when they don't need answers, only presence. Jake turned to the others. He never stopped coming here? Never, said a teenager who lived down the block. Even when he limped, even when it snowed so bad no buses ran, he'd still show up and sit like he was on duty. Jake's voice cracked. All this time I thought he was gone, but he was here, waiting for me. A woman handed Jake a bottle of water. Someone else brought a folded towel for him to sit on. The community that had watched Murphy for nearly a decade now gathered around Jake with the quiet reverence reserved for homecomings too impossible to explain. After a while, Jake stood, knees aching, heart pounding. Murphy rose beside him. He didn't hesitate when Jake opened the door to his car. He climbed in like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The crowd watched in silence as Jake buckled in, started the engine, then rolled down the window. "Thank you," he said, "for taking care of him, for letting him keep believing I'd come back." Linda stepped forward. "He took care of all of us in a way," she said with a smile. "You wouldn't believe how many people started showing up early just to sit near him. Some days, it felt like he was the only one reminding us to hope." Jake swallowed hard. He always was better at that than me. And then, with a soft bark from the passenger seat, the car pulled away. The crowd waved. And for the first time in 9 years, the bench beside the bus stop was empty, and it felt right. The road home felt both unfamiliar and instinctive, like waking from a dream you've been having for years but couldn't remember. Jake kept glancing at the passenger seat where Murphy now lay, head resting against the door, eyes scanning the trees and houses rushing past. Every so often, Jake would reach over and brush his fingers through Murphy's thick fur, just to confirm he was real, that this wasn't a memory or a dream or some cruel trick. "You look older," Jake whispered with a soft laugh. "Guess I do too." Murphy blinked, then let out a low, contented huff through his nose, as if to say, "Yeah, but we're still here." The cabin hadn't changed. It sat beneath 2 massive oaks, a little crooked from time and weather, but still standing, still waiting, like it had always expected someone would come back. Jake pulled into the gravel driveway slowly, as if afraid that speeding would shatter the fragile peace surrounding this reunion. The porch creaked under his boots. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and froze. The air was still. There was dust on the shelves, curled newspapers by the door. He had only come back once, years ago, just to grab a few things. Since then, it had been abandoned. Or preserved, depending on how you saw it. "Come on in," he said softly. Murphy padded past him like no time had passed at all. He walked straight into the living room, curled up in the exact same corner he always had, and closed his eyes. Jake watched, breath catching in his throat. "You remember everything, don't you?" He sank into the old armchair. The springs groaned beneath him, but he didn't care. His mind swirled with memories he thought he'd lost. Cold mornings with coffee on the porch, the sound of Murphy's paws across the floor, the way he'd wait patiently by the door when Jake left for work. Only now did Jake truly feel the weight of the missing years. Not just the time he'd lost, but the life he'd lost. And yet, this dog, this creature of bone and fur and heart, had waited, had believed. He made dinner, scrambled eggs, toast, and a little grilled chicken just for Murphy. The dog ate slowly, but his tail thumped once against the floor. Later, as night settled in and wind began whispering through the trees, Jake sat by the fire and ran his hand along the scar on Murphy's leg. It hadn't been there before. He knew that much. Some nights during those years, had Murphy fought to survive? Slept cold under awnings or in alleyways? How many miles had he walked before finding the bus stop and deciding to stay? Jake would never know. But he didn't have to, because what mattered wasn't what Murphy had been through. It was the fact that he hadn't given up. He hadn't stopped believing that one day his person would come back. And now Jake had. That night, Jake didn't sleep in his bed. He pulled a blanket off the sofa, curled up beside Murphy on the rug, and whispered into the silence, "I'm sorry it took me so long." Murphy shifted closer, rested his head against Jake's chest. And for the first time in nearly a decade, both of them slept through the night without waiting for anything. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows like a warm tide, washing away the shadows of the night before. Jake opened his eyes slowly, half expecting the cabin to be empty. The fire burned down to ash, the rug cold. But Murphy was still there, still pressed against his side, his breathing slow and deep, like he had finally allowed himself to rest. Jake smiled, a tired, quiet smile that reached places in his face that hadn't moved in years. He stood, stretched, and brewed a pot of coffee with beans so old he wasn't sure they'd still work. They did, sort of. Murphy followed him outside as he stepped onto the porch, the dog's gait stiff but steady. Together they stood there, taking in the crisp mountain air, the smell of pine, the chirping of birds that hadn't been there the last time Jake left this place. "We're home, buddy," he whispered. Murphy sat, tail brushing gently across the wood. Later that afternoon, Jake drove into town. He needed supplies, dog food, groceries, maybe even some fresh bedding for Murphy. But more than that, he needed answers. As he pulled into the small general store, heads began to turn. The town hadn't changed much. Same crooked sidewalks, same faded signage, same chatter outside the bakery. But Jake could feel it. People recognized him. Or maybe they recognized the dog sitting upright in the passenger seat. By the time he stepped out, a group had gathered near the door. "You're the guy," someone said. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I am. That's him, right? The bus dog." Jake looked at Murphy, who sat watching the crowd with his usual calm intensity. "Yeah, his name's Murphy." An older woman stepped forward. He remembered her vaguely. Owned the antique shop, used to bring her beagle to the farmer's market. "We all looked out for him," she said. "The whole town. Not officially, of course, but we made sure he had food, water, shelter. When it got cold, someone would bring a blanket or open the shed behind the florist shop." Another man chimed in. "He wouldn't let us near him. Not really, but he'd take the food. And he always showed up at the bus stop. Same time, every morning." Jake's throat tightened. "You kept him going," he said. "I don't even know how to thank you." A teenage girl stepped forward. "You don't have to. He gave us hope. Every day, people started going early just to see him. He made us believe that maybe, just maybe, not everything gets lost forever." Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. Murphy let out a low sigh from the truck, tail thumping once. Jake spent the next hour buying supplies, speaking with the store owner, and listening to more stories. A retired teacher shared how she used to read books aloud near the bench, just loud enough for Murphy to hear. A little boy said he'd left peanut butter crackers for him every Thursday. A bus mechanic admitted he'd repaired the bench's broken slat just so the dog would be more comfortable. These people hadn't just noticed Murphy. They had made him a part of their lives. Quietly, faithfully, like he had become a symbol for something more than a lost pet. He had become a fixture of hope. Jake left the store with a full cart and a full heart. That night, as he unpacked their supplies back at the cabin, Murphy followed him from room to room, not anxiously, just making sure it was all real, that this wasn't another stop on a long road of almosts. After dinner, they sat on the porch again, watching the sun disappear behind the pines. Jake placed a new tag on Murphy's collar, simple, with his name and address. He rubbed the dog's ear gently. "No more waiting, okay? You're home. For good." Murphy leaned his head into Jake's chest once more, and for the second time in 2 days the air around them felt light, like a burden had finally been shared. It was Mrs. Palmer, the retired librarian, who brought it up first. She visited Jake at the cabin 3 days after Murphy returned. She brought a basket of muffins and a framed photo, one that had circulated quietly around town for years. It showed Murphy sitting alone on the bench at the bus stop, morning light glowing around him like a quiet halo, his gaze fixed down the road. "Someone took this maybe 5 years ago," she said, placing it gently on the table. "We kept it up in the library. People would stop to look at it before catching the bus or picking up their kids." Jake stared at the image for a long time. He barely recognized the version of Murphy in the photo. Still proud, still steady, but leaner, older. That wasn't the dog he remembered from their years before the accident. That was the dog who had lived without him. "He belonged to everyone," Mrs. Palmer continued. "And now that you're back, we were thinking," she hesitated, "we want to put something at the stop. A bench plaque, maybe. Just something to remember what he meant to people. Not because he's gone, thank heavens, but because what he did mattered." Jake looked out the window where Murphy lay sprawled in the sun, one paw twitching as he dreamed. "You think people would want that? People have already donated," she said with a gentle smile. "They just wanted your blessing." Jake nodded, eyes stinging. Of course they can." The plaque was installed a week later. Brass, polished, mounted to the center of the bench where Murphy had sat for nearly a decade. It read, "For Murphy who waited, a symbol of loyalty, hope, and the home that never leaves us." The unveiling happened quietly. No press, no big speeches. Just neighbors and regulars, a few school kids, and Linda, the bus driver, who hugged Jake with tears in her eyes. Murphy was there, of course, sitting beside the bench he once watched from. He was slower now, more tired after walks, but he still held his posture like a sentinel. Jake noticed something during the ceremony. Murphy wasn't watching the road anymore. Not like he used to. Now he watched the people. He'd look at faces, tails wagging gently, and when a child would crouch to say hello, he wouldn't move away. He'd let them touch him. He'd close his eyes and just exist in the moment, as if the part of him that had been locked behind duty had finally come undone. That night, Jake brought Murphy back to the cabin and laid beside him on the rug. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the ceiling. Jake whispered, "You don't have to keep watch anymore, you know? You did your job, better than anyone ever could." Murphy stretched, paws twitching once more, and pressed his muzzle gently against Jake's side. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel like someone rebuilding a broken life. He felt whole, and not because something lost had been returned, but because it had never truly left him. It had been waiting, watching, hoping, at the edge of the road where all great journeys begin and end. Fall gave way to winter slowly that year, as if nature itself was reluctant to change the season on Murphy's story. The wind turned cooler, the trees shed the last of their color, and a light dusting of snow began to frost the roads leading up the mountain toward the cabin. Jake didn't mind. The stillness suited him. Life had found its rhythm again. Simple, quiet, filled with long walks, warm meals, and the comforting weight of Murphy always nearby. They fell into a routine not unlike the one they had shared before the accident, only softer, gentler. Jake had changed, so had Murphy, but not in ways that made them strangers. If anything, they fit together better now, like two books missing the same page, leaning against each other for balance. Jake had started writing again. Not anything formal, just a notebook he kept by the fire where he scribbled thoughts, stories, flashes of memory that came back in pieces. Some were about the old days before the accident. Others were about Murphy's time at the bus stop, as told through the stories neighbors had shared. But most were just about love. Quiet, waiting, unconditional love. Murphy had good days and slower ones. Jake took him to the vet, who marveled at his resilience. "You know," the doctor said, running a hand along Murphy's spine, "a lot of dogs wouldn't have lasted half as long. He must have had a reason." Jake smiled. He did. That winter, people began coming up the hill to visit them. Not many, just one or two at a time. Former bus passengers, children who had grown up watching Murphy each morning. a retired mechanic who remembered putting out a space heater by the bench one frozen January. They all came with a story, and they all brought something for Murphy: treats, toys, old photos. Jake never asked for any of it, but he accepted it like someone who finally understood what it meant to share your heart with the world. On Christmas morning, Jake awoke to find Murphy already waiting by the door, tail swaying gently. It had snowed in the night, thick and clean, and the world outside looked brand new. Jake opened the door, and they stepped onto the porch together, side by side, breathing in the sharp, silent air. And then something unexpected happened. Murphy barked. Not a warning, not a tired bark. A full, happy, alive sound. He looked up at Jake, tail thumping hard now, and took off into the snow, bounding a few feet before turning back, his eyes glowing like a pup again. Jake laughed. "Oh, now you want to play in your old age?" Murphy barked again. Jake grabbed his coat, his boots, and followed. For the next hour, they played in the snow like boys who didn't know how many winters they had left. Jake threw sticks. Murphy chased them. They rolled, stumbled, got covered in snow. And when it was over, they sat on the porch again, soaked and freezing, but grinning like fools. "Merry Christmas, buddy," Jake said. Murphy let out a low, contented groan, and rested his head in Jake's lap. Jake looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted. Blue stretched above them like a quiet promise. And in that moment, Jake didn't think about the years they'd lost. He didn't think about the pain or the waiting or what could have been. He just thought about now, about warmth, about this dog who had waited for him without question, and about the future they still had left to share. Fall gave way to winter slowly that year, as if nature itself was reluctant to change the season on Murphy's story. The wind turned cooler, the trees shed the last of their color, and a light dusting of snow began to frost the roads leading up the mountain toward the cabin. Jake didn't mind. The stillness suited him. Life had found its rhythm again. Simple, quiet, filled with long walks, warm meals, and the comforting weight of Murphy always nearby. They fell into a routine not unlike the one they had shared before the accident. Only softer, gentler. Jake had changed. So had Murphy. But not in ways that made them strangers. If anything, they fit together better now, like two books missing the same page, leaning against each other for balance. Jake had started writing again. Not anything formal, just a notebook he kept by the fire where he scribbled thoughts, stories, flashes of memory that came back in pieces. Some were about the old days before the accident. Others were about Murphy's time at the bus stop, as told through the stories neighbors had shared. But most were just about love. Quiet, waiting, unconditional love. Murphy had good days and slower ones. Jake took him to the vet, who marveled at his resilience. "You know," the doctor said, running a hand along Murphy's spine, "a lot of dogs wouldn't have lasted half as long. He must have had a reason." Jake smiled. He did. That winter, people began coming up the hill to visit them. Not many, just one or two at a time. Former bus passengers, children who had grown up watching Murphy each morning, a retired mechanic who remembered putting out a space heater by the bench one frozen January. They all came with a story, and they all brought something for Murphy: treats, toys, old photos. Jake never asked for any of it, but he accepted it like someone who finally understood what it meant to share your heart with the world. On Christmas morning, Jake awoke to find Murphy already waiting by the door, tail swaying gently. It had snowed in the night, thick and clean, and the world outside looked brand new. Jake opened the door, and they stepped onto the porch together, side by side, breathing in the sharp, silent air. And then something unexpected happened. Murphy barked. Not a warning, not a tired bark. A full, happy, alive sound. He looked up at Jake, tail thumping hard now, and took off into the snow, bounding a few feet before turning back, his eyes glowing like a pup again. Jake laughed. "Oh, now you want to play in your old age?" Murphy barked again. Jake grabbed his coat, his boots, and followed. For the next hour, they played in the snow like boys who didn't know how many winters they had left. Jake threw sticks. Murphy chased them. They rolled, stumbled, got covered in snow, and when it was over, they sat on the porch again, soaked and freezing, but grinning like fools. "Merry Christmas, buddy," Jake said. Murphy let out a low, contented groan, and rested his head in Jake's lap. Jake looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted. Blue stretched above them like a quiet promise. And in that moment, Jake didn't think about the years they'd lost. He didn't think about the pain or the waiting or what could have been. He just thought about now, about warmth, about this dog who had waited for him without question, and about the future they still had left to share.